Next up on This Week in Law, we've got a really interesting show for you with Joan Williams, Carolyn, Elefant, Evan Brown, and me. We're going to de-binderize all those women that were in there for Mitt Romney, talk about work-life balance, glass ceilings, and technology, all next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise, Howell, and Evan Brown. Episode 187, recorded November 9, 2012. Both rape guys lost. This episode of This Week in Law is brought to you by ShareFile. Enhance your workflow. Send files of almost any size easily and securely with ShareFile by Citrix. Try ShareFile today. For a free 30-day trial, go to sharefile.com, click the radio microphone, and enter TWiL. Hi, folks. It's Denise Howell, and thank you so much for joining us for This Week in Law. We're going to have a really interesting and fun show this week. Little different approach for our show this week in light of the U.S. presidential election, which turned on an 18-point gender gap, if you haven't been paying attention to that particular issue. We're going to open up all those binders full of women and take a look at tech's impact on work-life balance, gender bias in tech and the legal fields, women and entrepreneurship and leadership, and a whole lot more. And we've got a great panel here with us to do it. From the University of California, Hastings College of the Law, we've got Joan C. Williams. Joan is the Distinguished Professor of Law at UC Hastings. She's the UC Hastings Foundation Chair and the founding director of the Center for Work-Life Law. She's also a prolific writer at the Huffington Post, at Moms Rising, at the New Girls Network, and you're going to find her lots and lots of places online. Really thrilled to have you with us, Joan.
Delighted to be here.
Also joining us is the solo practitioner from myshingle.com, also a prolific writer and speaker herself, Carolyn Elefant. Hello, Carolyn.
Hi, Denise. How are you?
Great to see you. Now, Evan Brown's going to join us, too, our regular co-host here on TWiL. But Evan's having a bit of an issue with work-life balance at the moment and is trying to take care of some stuff at the office and jump off a call. So we're going to add him in just as soon as he's able to take care of things in Chicago and join us here where it really matters on This Week in Law. First and foremost, I promised we'd talk about the election. So let's go to Washington and do that. Waiting for Sanford and Son. There it is. I couldn't let our Sanford and Son bumper be dropped out of the show entirely. I love that one. We're always waiting for Red Fox.
And it looks like I showed up right at the right time.
Oh,
That's never
you're a Red Fox then.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Sorry for being late to the party, but it's great to be here.
It's great to see you, Evan. Thanks so much for joining us, taking care of whatever conflict you had there at work. That's going to be a big theme of our show today. So. Although I don't know,
this
you
practice
consider this
of law thing.
What do you consider this, Evan? Do you consider this work or a hobby? What we're doing here today?
Oh gosh, it's a great combination of both. I mean, it's the most thrilling thing I do all week, which I hope is not saying too much negatively about my life. But you're right, and what's implicit in your question there is this mix of what a person can be enthusiastic about at a very personal, kind of, close to the heart level, and how that translates into an actual vocation. And for me, in my experience in doing the show, is a wonderful mix of the two. So I guess at the fundamental level, I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about which category to put it in, because either the categories break down or it goes evenly into different categories. But it's a lot of fun, and it's a great thing to do. I really enjoy it.
I know. I'm right there with you. All right. Well, since we played the Washington bumper, let's talk about the election. Just happened a couple of days ago. It already feels like it's been a while. But women played a huge role in this election. And despite Mitt Romney having binders full of them, apparently they did not jump out of those binders to support him. too strongly in the election. There was an 18-point gender gap, which is certainly enough to swing things. Joan, you've written recently, I think it was back in September, about feminism on a tightrope and how women are less and less identifying themselves as feminists. That doesn't seem to have prevented them from voting in a way that, you know, if you were to pick the feminist of the two candidates in this election, I think that most people would probably pick Barack Obama, although I might get some argument on that. So what do you think about how this all shook out?
Well, I think it's part of a larger phenomenon between men and women. I think there's a class component. The larger phenomenon is just that men are encouraged to think of themselves as independent, strong, silent types who don't need anyone else. And that's fine, but it's not true. They typically have a partner who is doing the lion's share of taking care of their children so they can show up at work. They've typically had a mother who made very significant sacrifices so that they could grow up in the way they did. And this is crystal clear to many, many women that people need help. And people are sometimes dependent. People can have family members who are disabled. And so I think all of that feeds into the different attitude towards government that men and women have. I think that the class dimension also is that white men with high school education, sort of blue-collar men, we think of them traditionally in the United States, are really embattled. They have lost a tremendous amount of their ability to be breadwinners for the family, whereas professional men have not lost that in the same way. And so what you find among those blue-collar guys is a very insistent conviction that they need to show that they're every bit as manly as every other man in the society, and that they don't need any help often. And so those pressures of masculinity, I think, also drive men to vote in a certain way that drives them Republican, while those realities of femininity drives women to vote in a certain way, predominantly much more the trending Democratic.
So in this last election, we have the most amount of female senators ever in the Senate, 20 now, and a whole lot of other developments as far as governors and congresspeople. So women seem to be charging ahead in these places where they have influence and power. We're certainly making progress, but Carolyn, do you think it's enough progress?
Well, I guess it's hard to say. I mean, 20 women in the Senate is fairly substantial. It's more than it's been before. I think that for some reason in our country, there seems to be a disconnect between the electorate and women running for office. I mean, this is something that we don't see in other countries. In England, they've had a prime minister who was a woman. Israel had Golda Meir. I mean, that was like 30 or 40 years ago. So I don't know what it is about the U.S., which is supposedly one of the most egalitarian countries in the world, what the issue is with women not advancing. I don't get it. I do think that, it doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't make any sense.
I think I understand why it happens. I mean, I think there are a couple of different reasons. First of all, I think it's far easier for women to progress in a parliamentary system than it is in our system because of slates of candidates and a variety of other factors. And also, if you look at a lot of places in the world that have had very prominent female leaders long before the United States, partly it's because they have a tradition of dynasties and a very clear class structure. And so a woman, so to speak, can overcome being a woman because she's part of an established family.
Okay, I put in our rundown for this week a funny tweet from Glenn Fleischman, who's a journalist out there, who is paraphrasing the commentary after the election. He tweeted, "Women, the majority gender and deciding force in the 2012 presidential election, remain a minority." Joan, what do you think about that comment? I mean, he's clearly trying to draw some sort of irony there, and perhaps a criticism. You know, it's hard to read into an 140-character tweet of the notion that women still need a whole lot of assistance under the law. So let's assume we can read that into it, and can you respond?
Well, they certainly remain a minority in Congress. I mean, it's great that we have 20 women in the Senate, but on the other hand, we only have 20 women in the Senate at this late date. So they're a minority in that way. They're also a minority in terms of the way their interests have been represented. I think one of the things that contributed this time to the gender gap is, I mean, one of the tweet that I enjoyed most during an election night was a tweet that said, "Both the rape guys lost." And I think those comments were so far out of what most people would consider the mainstream that I think they probably shocked some women into voting Democratic that otherwise might not have.
Yeah, I can see where that would definitely happen. Let's get into some basics since we've come around to the fact that, you know, yes, you can see that progress is being made, but women are still a minority. And talk about some terms. You often hear the terms bias and discrimination and harassment out there. Discrimination and harassment are certainly things that have more legal ramifications, I think. Bias strikes me as something that can have legal ramifications too, but is more insidious. Do you agree with me on that, Joan?
Well, I mean, I think that bias and discrimination is a legal conclusion. Bias is really a social science finding. But I have recently completed a project called the New Girls Network, for which I've interviewed 125 women and basically summarized in about 5 minutes for them 35 years of literature on gender bias, and just asked them two simple questions. One is, any of that sound familiar? And the other is, what strategies have helped you navigate this bias in your career? And all of that information is on the New Girls Network website. But the fascinating thing is, of these 125 women, only 5 said that these patterns of bias did not sound familiar, and 3 out of 5 of those had founded their own businesses. So the experience of subtle bias, implicit bias, whatever you want to call it, seems to be extremely pervasive among professional women.
I had a question about the New Girls Network. I think at one point it was called the Wise Women's Network. Why the name change?
Yeah. Well, it was because of intergenerational communication issues. I actually ultimately wrote the book that summarized all of that research, the New Girls Network book, with my daughter. And I wanted it to be called Wise Women Speak. And she said, you know what, you're never going to get anyone under 50 to read a book called Wise Women Speak. She said it sounded like a coven of witches, which I must say sounded sexist to my old ears. But she said, you know, people my age, we call the girls girls, and we call the boys boys. I don't know what the big deal is. And I think there are one of the reasons I wanted to write it as someone of a very different generation is that I think sometimes women in their 60s have a lot of trouble connecting with younger generations of women. After all, we grew up in a really different world. And so that's why you see New Girls Network. It was actually quite a controversial choice among the women who I had assembled to help me write the book, who still call ourselves the Wise Women. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks for the update on that. Hey, Evan, you want to take a break from thinking about sports and guns and chime in on any of this?
No, I think I'm just fine thinking about sports and guns and all the other things you guys think about. I just need to. Padre SJ in the IRC pointed out that I'm going to need to go punch someone to get my manliness back on after having participated in this conversation. But no, I mean, sure, I'm happy to be a part of this conversation. My perspective as a relatively affluent white guy, I don't know what I really have to add other than to just say that I've seen real progress just in my 38 years. I've been practicing law now for about 12 years, and my experience in big law, a big law firm, my firm in particular, I'm really encouraged with the trends that we see, adding into that the whole notion that there are more women having been elected to Congress, more women in the Senate in particular, than ever before. And so, all I can see is that there are positive trends in this direction, and the workplace is a good place when there is gender diversity, when people are treated equally. And so, everything that I would have to comment on this stuff goes from that general proposition of recognizing that the era of the Todd Aikens and the Richard Murdochs seems to be passing us by. I hope that that's reflective of a truer reality in all of this stuff, and it's a meaningful conversation to be having. And now back to thinking about the Chicago Bears.
Now, as Steve Jobs once said about people starting to embrace the personal computer at the back when they first started Apple, people couldn't type, but death would eventually take care of this. I think, to your point. What I wanted to do at this point is kind of go around the horn as we're talking about bias and discrimination and harassment and, the nuances of those things, and see if any of you have any horror stories, personal experiences, recent or more distant past, about how those things can concretely manifest themselves in the workplace. Carolyn, you are of course the solo practitioner, but maybe you have something from your past that is relevant to this.
Well, I worked for law firms. I worked for big firms during my summer. I worked for the federal government, and I worked for another firm. I personally I've never had any problems. Part of it is I just don't let things bother me. But what I have noticed, and this may be sexist or biased in itself, but I've noticed that the women who tend to be treated poorly, at least overtly, on the jobs that I've been on are women who are very attractive. When I worked at law firms, partners would say things to them, or just like these, give them looks that were just so nasty. And then they tended to get the worst assignments. They tended to be treated very differently from me. And I think it was because of how they looked. They certainly weren't any less intelligent than I was. I found them to be, very up on things and very, just as well trained for these positions as I was. But I was offended by how they were treated in those positions. So that's what I would tend to see. Or I'd see male partners making comments about attractive secretaries. Those kinds of things. But I've never experienced the bias ever, not in law school. Maybe I did. Clearly I'm not the most successful, person on the planet, and I could attribute it to my gender, but I prefer to attribute it to my own personal failings instead. But I just, that's been the experience that I've had, and that is my theory, is that the women who are more attractive perhaps are more of a threat. That's just my observation, and you can all attack me for that sexist remark.
Wow, there was a lot to unpack in there, Carolyn. And, a couple of questions that go to things that Joan has written about in the past. Joan, you've talked about how women make a choice often, whether they know they're doing it or not, whether it's conscious or not, to be liked or to be respected. Do you think that some of that plays into what Carolyn was observing?
Well, I actually have sort of a different viewpoint than Carolyn, partly because I do feel I have personally experienced various forms of bias, but much more importantly, I've talked to these 125 women, and I talk to women all the time. I've given basically trainings across the country where when I describe these 4 patterns, women sort of sit up and listen. They've definitely heard them. So I'll just give some brief examples. The first of these patterns is called prove it again, where women feel they have to provide more evidence of competence in order to be seen as equally competent than men. And very commonly, women feel like men are being judged on their potential, women on their achievements. Women often feel that their mistakes are noticed more and remembered longer than men's. Those are 2 prove it again patterns that are very common in women's, at least in women's perceptions. The second major type of bias is what you referred to. I call it the tightrope. Where because high-powered jobs are sort of coded masculine, and we think of masculine behaviors as needed in order to succeed in them. You need to be commanding, have a low voice, be very self-confident. Women really have to walk a tightrope between being masculine, acting in a masculine way to be seen as competent, but not being too masculine, because of course a woman who is too masculine is seen as somehow odd. And so these tightrope patterns, you have to worry about being seen as too feminine or too masculine. And an example of a too feminine problem is when women are expected sort of to do the office housework. I was really interested in these interviews. Women are very commonly expected to still take notes, offer the phone, sometimes even make coffee. But at a deeper level, they're expected to do whatever's really important but very undervalued. So, for example, professors are expected to serve on a zillion committees, which actually do not count when it comes to tenure. Women partners are expected often to be service partners and let the men be the rainmakers. And then the 2 masculine problems are really the what a witch problems. And women very often find that if they are assertive and firm, that they're seen as very witchy. And those are just 2 out of the 4 patterns. But women do recognize these patterns if you describe them based on the literature.
What are the other 2? Can I have you just tell us the other 2 patterns so we've got them all on the table?
Oh, the other 2 patterns, the third one is gender bias triggered by motherhood, which is actually extremely strong, much stronger than the 2 glass ceiling patterns I just talked about. And the final pattern I call tug of war, or gender wars, and that's when gender bias against women turns into fights among women, and that's also extremely pervasive.
Carolyn, what were you going to say?
I was just going to suggest with the Joan, what you had said about the women taking on some of those less valued tasks. I think that, in that situation, it may be that sometimes women are more accommodating and more willing to do that. But one thing that I've noticed with those less valued tasks is technology has kind of changed that, because I know that, since 1996, when, the web came into being, I found that, when I was on committees or things where I used to, to get noticed, would have volunteered to like take notes or something. I could volunteer to set up a website or to tweet about something or to set up a Facebook page. And all of a sudden, because of technology, it's easier to volunteer to do something secondary that has a lot of visibility. So in some ways, I think technology can help women get out of that loop if they have a lot of those skills. And I found in my experience that women are much more skilled with some of these, social media technologies than many of the men. And I'm not going to go into who's better or worse and make more gender commentary on that either. So I don't want to keep getting myself into a hole on public internet lines.
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
I think that's a great strategy. And that's one of the things that we say in the New Girls Network is, first of all, choose whether and how much of this office housework you're going to do, and at a certain point you have to draw a line. But everybody's going to do some, and women are going to do more than men. That's the reality, because if they refuse, they're seen as not theirs. And so what you've done is very savvy, is you've said, okay, I'm going to do that office housework, but I'm going to make it work for me because I'm going to do it through these public disseminations that raise my profile. That's really strategy, just the kind of strategy that women need to share.
I think of it as the who waters the bamboo problem. Because it's a problem that migrates over from one's personal life to one's professional life. In our house, we have some ornamental bamboo growing in one of the downstairs bathrooms. And I am the person who waters the bamboo. I have a husband in the house, a son in the house. It would never even occur to them to water the bamboo. They would love to see the bamboo just shrivel up and die. And, because it matters to me, I water the bamboo. And I think that women often find themselves in that situation where, they do something because it matters to them. It may matter to other people too, but they just don't think about it. And so by default, you're just going to get it done and do it. Hey, Evan, I have a question for you on the war stories front. One of the, aside from just, the water the bamboo problem, I think that there's perhaps a perception, and you can tell me what you think from your place in a law firm as a litigator there, that women litigators can't hack it. That there is, a difference in disposition that enables someone to be able to take a deposition or try a case that makes women, try as they might. You can insert whatever competency adjective you like. They can be prepared. They can be aggressive. All the things that you need to do those skills, but they're just not going to be able to do them as well as men. Do you perceive that kind of bias around you?
I do. I want to make a very important qualification on it, though. I think it's highly generational. I think it's very closely correlated with the age of the woman. When she went to law school is probably more relevant maybe than just her chronological age. Among the women, and I don't want to actually put numbers on the ages and all this stuff, but my experience has been that the perception of the that the men perceive the skills, let's just keep it to your particular example here, in litigation, of women to be not as aggressive, perhaps more emotional, and therefore likely to fly off the handle, lose a temper in a deposition, or not lose a temper, but to, break down in some way. And I think that's, erroneous, but that's what I think the perception is. With folks who are closer to my age and younger, I just don't see that as well. And I have speaking from me personally, not to just try to be build my own self up and talk about how, even-handed I am and how I lack bias and prejudice in my own life and all that stuff. But, I will just go ahead and say it. I certainly do not feel that way. I do not experience those prejudice toward my female colleagues, whether they be my age, just a tiny bit older, or certainly younger. I could walk down the halls and point out to you dozens of very skilled women litigators who I just think are wonderful at what they do, and it's because they have a calm presence about them, not to be mistaken with an overdone sense of self-confidence that puts them into the witchy category, to use Joan's terminology on that. Interestingly, though. And, maybe I'm putting myself at risk here if my colleagues are listening to the show wondering who in particular I'm talking about. So let me just say I'm generalizing to my whole career now, not just my experience at this particular firm. The older the woman, the more likely she is to exhibit those characteristics of really having to, maybe this is what you were talking about, Joan, prove it again. I think you were using some kind of terminology like that, where I attribute it to the environment that they must have gone to law school in, as if there is something extra to prove because of the prejudices that were more prevalent in the among their contemporaries at that period of time when they were learning how to be lawyers here. So that's my observation, and I think the biggest point, or the most important factor in all of this that I'm trying to articulate and identify here, is that it certainly does seem to be correlated with the level of age, level of experience, which to me illuminates a positive trend that I was talking about when at the beginning of my first comments a few moments ago, which I would think is a positive thing, inarguably.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and make witchy women our first MCLE passphrase for this episode of This Week in Law. Hopefully that's a good and memorable one. It's interesting that you bring up age, Evan, because, you are about a decade younger than I am. And I think at some point, people who, as a woman who worked in a big firm, I can say that there's a very sweet spot, I think, for women to feel empowered in a law firm. And it's not when you first get there right out of law school, because, at that point, people think you're just, inexperienced and young and can't get anything done. Probably everybody, regardless of their gender, suffers from that when they're first starting out. But it may be worse for women. I don't know. So you've got that.
I knew that I was awesome the first day.
Yeah.
It's just
Sure. You've got that you're battling against. And then when you get, to be at my advanced age and all the systems of your body, that have functioned for you just fine since birth, they've all been given their own personal handbasket and are happily journeying off to hell. And, you can barely sort of amble around in a positive way anymore. And you've probably got some children to look after to boot if you're a woman. So you've got this sort of sweet spot, I think, of the late 20s to maybe late 30s. Joan, do you think I'm onto anything there?
Well, I mean, certainly motherhood is one of the things that knocks women off track, and whether that's because they choose to, because of their choices, or because these institutions are designed for people who don't have childcare responsibilities. I mean, I think it's the second. But I do think that, I've been around, and you can see that I've been around a long time. This is probably the fourth decade in which people have told me, oh, this is just generational, it's going away. All we have to do is be a little patient for certain people to die. I actually don't believe that. I think that the gender pressures on men to, particularly professional men, to be, quote, a successful man, which means a man with a successful career, have remained largely unchanged. And I think for that reason, the behavior of successful men has remained largely unchanged. And if you look at the top of virtually any major institution in the country, what you will see is that overwhelmingly it's peopled by men married to homemakers. So it's very true that there are generational changes, but I don't think that they're among the group of people who actually run both politics and the economy. I don't see a lot of those changes taking place.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of Tumblr sites, one second, Ev, that I just want to drop in for people to check out if they are thinking that this stuff is all changing and getting better. Not necessarily in all contexts, according to these Tumblr blogs that are very entertaining, I must say. One is called Academic Men Explain Things to Me, and one is called Lawyer Men Explain Things to Me. And they're just places where people are submitting their experiences of, being talked to in a very sort of patronizing way about what a comma does. Somebody getting a shoulder rub at a hearing. I'm not a real lawyer because I work for my dad. And on the academic side, too, a whole bunch of war story kind of episodes there. And what it makes me, it makes me think of my own experiences. Unlike Carolyn, I certainly have experienced things that I consider bias in the workplace in my own career. I've sat in partners' offices gazing at their background wallpaper on their computer screen with bondage images up there. I've definitely had a partner grab me in an elevator and do things he shouldn't have done. I've had, this is, I think, the funniest thing that happened to me. And I think it would be a great law school exam question, Joan, because I'm not sure how, if someone were to bring the lawsuit about it, who you would sue. I was going in to take a deposition. I may have told this story on the show before, so bear with me if you've heard it. I was going in to take a deposition, and the opposing party, the person I was to take the deposition of, and for everyone who's seen The Social Network, depositions are those lengthy sessions where you're sitting around in a lawyer's office and the opposing party's lawyer is asking you questions if you're involved in a lawsuit. So I'm going to take this man's deposition, and he shows up in a tie that had a half-clad woman on it. And so we're taking the deposition. We go through the day. We're signing off and saying goodbye. And he goes, well, I guess you did a pretty good job. You didn't even notice my tie. It didn't seem to rattle you. But that was why he wore the tie. So, I think this stuff continues to happen to this day. And people, mea culpa, you can argue about whether any of the stuff that happened to me was actionable. It may have been. I probably could talk to employment lawyers who would say it was. But I didn't sue. And I think a lot of people make that decision that, you've made an investment in your job, your career, you're trying to work with these people. Certainly suing them throws a wrench into that. Joan, do you think that this is a problem that women face?
It's definitely a problem that women face day to day, and women my age face it, and women in every decade face it. And yet, I hear what Evan is saying, and that I'm not saying nothing has changed, because really things have changed. And I was just reading actually the manuscript of a book that was talking about fatherhood. And it said basically 25% of fathers play the same sort of disengaged provider role that they've played for decades. 25% of fathers really do behave much more like mothers traditionally have done, and take jobs that are shaped around their children's needs and scale back their ambitions. And then there's that whole bunch of fathers in the middle. And I think it's unbelievably important that, at least in this small sample, there's a hefty percentage of men who have really rethought what their life goals are. And their life goals are much more similar to the life goals traditionally held by women. And yet, so I think the glass is definitely half full, but boy, is it half empty.
All right, well, that's a great transition to talk about work-life balance and to get Evan back into the conversation as a dad and a lawyer. And talk about, too, whether, we're talking about gender bias here. Is it time to start thinking about bias against people with families in general, and bias against people who don't have families, who think that they're carrying the weight of folks who, need to take all of this time to care for their little rugrats, who maybe someone else has made a permanent decision that they're not going to have. So Evan, as a dad and a lawyer, tell us about your work-life balance formula.
It's difficult. It's really difficult, and I feel like it's more difficult for me than what it would have been a generation or more ago, because of what Joan was just talking about. The society expects from me to exhibit not only these traits of being success-driven, trying to be the best lawyer that I can, the most successful, get the most clients, do all that stuff. That there's that driving ambition that I have, which I think is inherently good, and I'm not going to be apologetic for it in any sense. At the same time, my wife and I have chosen, and we chose this early on, actually as early as our first date, that we were going to go with the model that she's going to stay home with the children, and it works very well for us. And she is bought into it. I'm certainly not holding her in any position of servitude. It's what she wants to do, and I know it's reflective of millions and millions of families across the country. At the same time, I feel very often caught between. Saying between a rock and a hard place is not exactly right, but I certainly feel like I'm being pulled at both ends, because I have these ambitions that I have that are intrinsic to me because I want them. I want to experience success and raised to a certain level of prestige through my profession, but I'm also very invested, in fact, primarily invested in the family life, being a good husband, being a good father, setting a good role model for my sons, and also doing that by example and through participating in life with them. So again, because of that intrinsic desire that I have to be present at home in the family life, and also a certain societal expectation that I will do that, I really feel stretched, and I feel like it's more difficult than what it would have been if I could have been more of the Ward Cleaver, wear a coat and tie to work every day, come home. I don't know if Ward Cleaver drank scotch. He probably didn't, but come home, kick off my shoes, have scotch, smoke a pipe, have dinner on the table with a wife. The 1950s stereotype. That sure does look easy for men in contrast to the kind of pressures that I feel. And I guess on balance, these are more. It's a pressure that I feel internally rather than coming from the expectations of my employer, because I don't look at my employer as putting these pressures on me to figure out work-life balance. I look at it as my clients putting that pressure on me. And that's a pressure that I gladly accept because I knew what I was signing up for when I decided to be a lawyer, that you serve your clients and you serve your clients' interest. You don't necessarily serve your law firm's interest. You do that. You serve your law firm's interest only to the extent that that's serving your client's interest. So I don't get all upset and feel like I need to seek redress because of this pressure that I feel from my employer. I need to figure it out myself and be resourceful in collaboration with my wife and, making the decisions of how we're going to raise our family and how we're going to be just a good person in all of society. So that's how I feel. It's tough to be a man these days. And I'm not afraid to admit that. I don't feel like it detracts from my masculinity at all. It just, that's a reality of it today.
Yeah, I agree with you, Evan. I think you have the demands on both sides that traditionally men have not had. Also, traditionally, none of us have been as connected as we are now. Joan, is this helping or hurting?
I'm sorry, connected
technologically. Let me throw out an example. Another great Tumblr blog called Life in Big Law. There is a post that someone put up on the 29th of October about Hurricane Sandy. And the person posts, when you heard about Hurricane Sandy and all the subways being closed, you were like, on the bright side, there's no way they'll make me come in tomorrow. And then the red light on your BlackBerry blinked ominously with an email from work saying that all attorneys are expected to work from home until power/internet access goes out. And it's like, touche. So,
that's
certainly
amazing.
Yeah, isn't that funny? So there is technology allowing you to be resourceful, and there is technology allowing you never to leave work behind. So how do we navigate that?
I mean, one of the things that I've been sort of a holdout for is the term work-life balance. The more chic term these days is work-life integration. And for me, I think that signals a joyful embrace of work eating up the rest of your life, which is certainly what is expected of professionals. I mean, they are expected, it's called the norm of work devotion. They're expected to show a devotion for work and always putting the needs of their jobs or their clients or whatever thing else. So I think that has technology helped or hurt? It's done both. There are a lot of women and men, for that matter, who now can spend more time with their families or have far more flexible schedules because of technology. On the other hand, whereas we used to be protected from our incredibly intense work ethic in the United States by the fact that we walked out of our office, now the only thing that that protects us from having a job that eats up our life are social norms, but we don't have those social norms. And so I do think that technology has led to a great American speed up in a very, very profound way.
Yeah, I think that we're still trying to figure out all the contours of that and how not to speed up, perhaps. I did just read that Volkswagen apparently late last year implemented some controls where for employer-issued devices that employees were using to get email and things away from the office, that they were actually putting timers in that said you will only be able to receive mail, this long after you've started work or this long before you're supposed to be at work. I could see that there might be some wage hour concern that would drive that kind of a control, in addition to a balance-oriented concern. So maybe we'll see more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a serious wage hour concern. I was actually giving a briefing on Capitol Hill one time, and somebody from one of the associations said, yes, we wanted our work-life balance and technology. We wanted our people who were sales reps to, we gave them BlackBerries, and we wanted them to do work and research on the products during their own time. And, then the DOL came down on us like a ton of bricks and said we couldn't do that and terrible. And what I said to him is, actually, what I think we're asking your employees to do is called work. And, and that is a serious wage and hour problem and should remain so.
Right. Hey, Joan, I know you need to go. It's noon Pacific time, but we have enjoyed talking with you so much. We really appreciate your taking the time out of your schedule from UC Hastings and all of the great work that you do there. Is there anything you'd like to leave folks with? We're going to continue on with the show, and we hope you'll tune back in and maybe give us your comments after the fact. Anything you want to sign off with?
Just one final thing, again, to Evan, men actually now report higher levels of work-family conflict than women, and for exactly the reason that Evan has articulated so well, that in the word cleaver days, the man was expected to show up and maybe play a game or two of catch. But now, even men married to homemakers hold themselves to are involved with children's everyday lives, and that shows up very strong. And I think that does make it harder for men to balance. On the other hand, I personally think that that will make for better relationships with their children and a more satisfying life. But day to day, I'm with you, Evan, not that easy. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Joan. We'll see you on the interwebs. Folks, you can follow Joan on Twitter. She is Joan C. Williams. And if the IRC, while she's been on with us, is any indication, folks are going to definitely want to keep up with her tweets and writings and thoughts in general. She's a very well-read and articulate person on all of these issues. So we will soldier on without her here and do our best in her absence. Carolyn, you have certainly spoken a lot and thought a lot about technology and its role in our lives as workers and professionals. What's your take on the friend versus foe issue?
Well, I've always thought it was a positive to the extent that there's a failing. It's sort of like, guns don't kill people, people with guns kill people. It's sort of like with technology. It's not technology in and of itself that is the enemy. It's people not being able to control themselves. It's the, moronic employer who thinks that the employee sitting home and, looking up things about a product on their BlackBerry is not doing work, but, supporting the company or something. So, to me, it's nothing but a positive. It's true that it's something that's always there, but the fact that it is always there has enabled me to, when my daughters were younger, to be able to spend time with them and still be able to continue my practice or to continue writing. I think it's opened technology, social media have opened so many doors for women who previously would have, left the workforce and never come back. And especially in this economy, can you imagine somebody who left the workforce in 2005 or 06 thinking, if even somebody who worked at a big firm leaving then thinking that they were going to come back after their kids were older, and the whole in that time, while they were home and out of the workforce, things have completely changed. Technology enables them to reinvent themselves, to write, to pursue interests that are appealing to them, to reinvent themselves. And I think, for all of the negatives, and believe me, I complain all the time. My daughters complain all the time about me being online too much. I would not go back to a period before it, because I think that it is creating amazing opportunities. So I'm very bullish on it.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where I think, Evan, you might almost have it worse as a man. And again, people may disagree on this, but, it's important to you, as you've said, to be able to be participatory in your children's lives. But if you're out of the office, at some sporting event with them or otherwise, engaging with them during work hours and you need to be reached by a client and they call you up and there's background noise and it's clear that you're out in some, field with balls flying around or wherever you may be, that's I think that the negative perception of that is almost worse for you than it would be for a woman, because people would expect, she's mom, she's got to go do mom things. But for you, you're almost, I think, as a man, traditionally anyway, expected to be there for your clients during work hours. Do you perceive that?
Well, I hear what you're talking about, and I think that's a legitimate phenomenon. Of course, it's really hard to generalize on these things. Perhaps I'm not the most reflective of what reality is on that, because I think my clients are all really cool, and they wouldn't think too much of that. But I represent really savvy people who are, forward thinking and wouldn't think a whole lot of the fact that there are kids in the background or, horses neighing or whatever the background noise du jour may be. At the same time, I acknowledge that there definitely is a reality in certain practice areas and in certain industries as well. Maybe the banking and financial industries wouldn't be as tolerant of guys on the phone with kids screaming in the background. That's just an impression that I have. I may be woefully overgeneralizing. So what I guess what my comment is as I hear what you're saying, I certainly try to find a quiet place, if I do have to take a call for home, because for anything, it's just really stressful to try to have a serious conversation when your 5-year-old wants to have your attention and all that stuff. So it definitely is a phenomenon. As far as whether there's a difference between whether men are judged more harshly because of doing something like that than women, I just don't know. I mean, I'm interested to hear that you think that there might be a difference. I think that's something to think about. I don't have an impression one way or the other whether there's a gender difference in how people perceive that. Let's do a poll.
I think in some ways it's less. I work with a couple of lobbyists, and one of them has this 4-year-old who he adores him. He will always say, at 5 o'clock if we're meeting, he said, "I've got to go. My wife's working late." I think if a woman says, "I've got to go to pick up my kids," that they're going to be judged worse. But I think that as more men do it, things start to shift and it becomes more of a norm. And so, typically, even though I spent a lot of time working at home when my kids were small and, doing things sort of around their schedules, I never told that to anybody. I mean, even now, I am very hesitant to tell somebody if I'm leaving early because I've got to, pick my daughter up from somewhere or help her with homework. But I found myself more willing to share that information as I see men doing it. So that's one of my first observations. The second thing is, though, one of the reasons I don't share this information a lot, but one of the reasons why I do work from home is in my first job, I worked for the federal government, and my boss was a female who's really ahead of her time. The 3 deputies in her office were all moms who worked part-time. And when I used to call them for, they were my supervisors, and when I used to call them for feedback on my, my briefs or things that had to be reviewed before they could go out, and they weren't available, or they said, "I can't talk because I'm home with my kids," it infuriated me. It made me so upset. And I really feel that if, in some ways I feel a job is a job, and who's ever at that job, male or female, has got to be there to carry out those responsibilities. And I knew that when I had kids, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. And I didn't necessarily think it was fair for somebody who, for me to delay somebody's work product because I couldn't get back to them or something like that. And so that was part of the reason why after I started my practice and I did have kids, I stayed in it as long as I did, because at least I could control my schedule, I could control my clients, and I could sort of control the the surroundings. But I think that whoever had raised the point about the bias against people without children, I think that can eventually become something, that's a concern as more men are willing to say, I'm leaving early for kids, and as women are willing to follow their example. Well, who does that leave in the office? The people without kids.
People without kids. And I don't know, maybe they become a protected class at some point, or maybe parents do, neither of which is the case now. And I think this discussion shows how, the protected classes under the law, of people, the things that are barred in the way of discrimination, sex, religion, all of the various categories in the different states and under federal law. Those two things are definitely not there. And I'm not saying that we need more protected classes, but it makes for attention, don't you think, Evan?
Protected classes are difficult because everybody can articulate a reason why they ought to fit into a protected class. So that's why it's problematic. Yes. Sure, there are some fundamental ones. I guess what I just said is it's kind of a sliding or a slippery slope. So let me try to claw my way back up that slippery slope kind of argument is that, yeah, definitely there should be some protected classes, and I think Title VII does a pretty good job already in articulating what those are. You just enumerated them, at least most of them, there.
A couple. I actually pulled it up before the show so that we could tell people just to remind them, because it's not something you think about every day. Federal law makes it illegal to discriminate based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions, disability, age, citizenship status, and genetic information. Those are all the federal ones. And then the states do different things. In California, for example, I thought this was pretty interesting given things that we've talked about on the show before. Your political activities or affiliations are, those are protected. So you cannot be, there cannot be workplace decisions, hiring or otherwise, made with regard to your political activities or affiliations. That we always bring up, Evan, when we're talking about employers and the First Amendment, that they're not covered by the First Amendment. But in California, that almost sort of brings the First Amendment into the workplace there.
Yeah, it really does, in a pretty dangerous way. What if my political position was to say that's a really dumb law and that there ought to be discrimination?
Okay, no, we've just gotten really circular.
Well, see there. No, I didn't get circular. I was just making up a hypothetical under the statute. Thank the California legislature.
That's right. Okay, well, we're here with Evan Brown and Carolyn Elefant. Joan Williams was with us and had to take off, but we've got a lot more of her writings to unpack here on the show today. We're having a gender bias and technology-oriented episode of This Week in Law. And one of the reasons we're able to do it is because of our sponsor, ShareFile, who we are very, very grateful for. When you need to email a file, if you're going to email it, you're just sending it. But with ShareFile, it opens up a whole world of possibilities. Rather than as an attachment, your file is sent as a secure link that allows you to collaborate and share information and get work done. See, this is technology helping us get our work done. It's always under your control. Files can be almost any size and be so much more efficient. ShareFile is a secure way to transfer files that are either too large or too confidential to send by email. And it's so easy to use. Plus, ShareFile allows you to access files remotely from your laptop, tablet, or smartphone. So when you're cut off from the office by Hurricane Sandy, you're definitely going to be able to continue serving your clients' needs with ShareFile. That's why so many business professionals rely on it every day as an important part of their daily workflow. Now, one of the things I really like about ShareFile is it's just so darn easy to integrate into your work-life balance. You don't have to really do much of anything except for go through a very brief sign-up process on a website. You're not downloading software. It's so easy for you to set up, and then it becomes very integrated in with your email, your website, however you're going to be interacting with your clients and customers. And on their end, all they have to do is get the email. And of course, they're all doing that anyway to begin with. So try ShareFile today. When you go to their site, you're going to get a special offer, a full 30-day free trial. Go to sharefile.com, click on the radio microphone, and enter TWiL, TWiL. Remember, visit sharefile.com and type in TWiL. Okay, let's talk some Marissa. Marissa Mayer, of course, CEO of Yahoo, moved on over there, announced she was moving on over there from Google in the summer. Same day, announced that she was pregnant with her first son, has had her child now. So now she is Yahoo's CEO with a month-plus old baby. Took 2 weeks of maternity leave to when she had the baby. That's got to be, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly caused a lot of online discourse and discussion with some people, in the Right On Marissa column, don't let pregnancy and childbirth slow you down. And I think that the more prevalent voices saying, what on earth are you thinking? This is a terrible example, bad for women, bad for you personally, Marissa. 2 weeks of maternity leave is not enough. So she's been much in the news, and I'm curious to see how you guys think she is walking on that tightrope that Joan mentioned. What do you think, Evan?
Well, first of all, now that Joan's off the conversation, is it all right that every time you say Marissa, I do a wolf whistle? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she is definitely getting back to Joan's point that there are choices that women make about being likable or respected. I think she's trying to have it both ways for sure.
Yeah, and she's doing a great job at that.
Yes.
She's to be commended in every respect. She exhibits, exemplary leadership skills, and that's just not because she has the title of CEO of Yahoo. She has worked to get to that position legitimately. I mean, she's younger than I am. That's. I mean, I take that for what it's worth. I mean, I hold her in high regard, terrific high regard for that. And so, whether she wants to make the decision to take a week or 2 weeks, or as little time as physically possible, giving the undeniable trauma of giving birth,
right.
That's a decision that is entirely in her province to make, and I just don't see the point in, certainly from my perspective, any commentary on that, because she has a unimaginable responsibility for leading Yahoo. She took the job, obviously, knowing that she was only a couple of months away from giving birth. So I see nothing but positive things to say about Marissa in this situation. She's doing great things.
Right. Who was the basketball player who famously said, "I'm not a role model"? Was it Charles Barkley?
Charles Barkley. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's no obligation on Marissa to be a role model or to make decisions that she thinks are not going to be the best for her, of course. But it has been controversial. What do you think, Carolyn?
So really, I find it to be a hard question. I know that a week after my daughter was born, I had scheduled a presentation, and I went to it. And I didn't even tell anybody I'd had a baby. So it wasn't actually that difficult. I mean, leaving aside the issues with the birth, I mean, in some ways, babies, in some ways it's almost, this part of the decision, I think, in some ways is easy. I mean, I'm assuming that even though she's gone back to work, she is in a situation, I mean, she's just had CEO of the company. So, and she probably does have people who are helping her out. And she can have people who come in and out if she wants to see her son. I mean, babies at this age do sleep a lot. So, assuming that she had a smooth childbirth and that she didn't have a C-section. I mean, she would have a C-section, then she'd be like superhero to be up and walking on a job after 2 weeks. That's just like crazy. But I don't know that at this stage it's so much of a question. I think the question becomes harder is how much time both she and her husband are spending at the office when their child is older, when her son wants somebody to play with, when their son comes home from school and, wants their mom or their dad to, study for a test with them, or wants their parents to take them somewhere on the weekend. I mean, I think that's where the decision becomes more difficult. And I think that's where it'll be interesting to see who's going to step in and do that. I mean, I think that to the extent that children have parents, one parent should be with the child as much as possible, but I don't think it has to be the mom. And in her case, it may be that her husband, and I think her husband, he's like a venture capitalist or something, or does he work for himself? He may have more flexibility to do that. So at this stage, I mean, I don't think it's a good example to set for people because, it sets an unrealistic expectation that might not be right for everybody. But for her own personal situation, I don't see it as that much of a big deal. I don't know that at this point she's really missing all that much. I think the harder question is down the road. And even now that my daughters are 16 and 13, I mean, it doesn't go away. They still need somebody around some of the time as long as they're under your roof.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Women have fought for these parental leave laws and privileges, and men too. More and more taking advantage of parental leave, although it's a much more rare thing. Evan, can you think of any men in your office who have taken parental leave at the birth of their child?
Well, I have a colleague who was just in the office right next door to mine, and his wife gave birth to twins, and he took a week off, which I thought was not a whole long time, not a very long time. When my sons were born in 2005 and 2007, I took 2 weeks off, and that seemed. Well, I mean, of course, I would love to have been home with them longer than that. But honestly, I was ready to get back into the routine of things. There's a lot of work to be done, and after a couple of weeks, I sort of sensed that I was losing a certain sense of helpfulness around being home at that point. So I guess my conclusion from that is we shouldn't necessarily equate value with the duration of the parental leave. Sometimes the best thing that you can do is get back and start to get back to, normalcy, if that's the best term for all of this stuff. So, I mean, but it's also complicated by this theme that we've been talking about here of how technology enables us to do work even when we're not at work. I remember 7 years ago when my first son was born, I was answering client emails the very next day. I was, answering emails from the hospital. Certainly, it was making phone calls and stuff. So it's very difficult to go off the grid and distance yourself from what your responsibilities are. And those, like I was saying earlier, those responsibilities are to your clients, and any professional knows that's what your primary responsibility is, and that's just part of performing the services that we do in a free market economy like this.
Yeah, I like the idea that you take some time when the children are born, but build into your long-term approach the fact that this is a time commitment outside of work that is going to be ongoing for at least 16, 18 years into the future.
Yeah, that's a much more important point that Carolyn's making. Yeah, I mean the birth is just the kickoff. That's not even that has nothing to do. And you both are further down the parenting road than I am. Denise, only slightly. You are. Yeah. So it's an understatement to say that the actual process of bringing baby home is all that much relative to the whole experience.
Right. Hey, Gord McLeod in IRC has pointed out an interesting model. Let me ask first, Evan, when you took leave when your kids were born, was that paid leave or no?
Yes, it was. It was vacation time.
It was vacation time. So you didn't actually take paternity leave? Right.
I did not. And, it made a difference.
Here's what Brian Brushwood is doing. Definitely for anyone who listens to the TWiT network, you know who Brian is. For anyone who doesn't, he's a personality here on TWiT and elsewhere who is an entertainer and host of many of our shows. He's doing an Indiegogo campaign to fund his ability to take paternal leave from touring. So, because he has a public personality, he can probably do that with some efficacy. I don't know that a lot of workaday people can do it. I don't know that a lot of workaday people, it's fun to talk about Marissa Mayer, but I don't know that a lot of day-to-day people would be in her kind of situation. Of course, to have the flexibility to bring your child in whenever you want. She's the CEO. She gets to call the shots on this sort of thing. Yahoo has on-site childcare, which I think, must be enormously helpful in this regard. And
don't forget the resources that $59 million a year salary can buy for you when the baby doesn't happen to be there in the office.
Indeed, she is sort of the exception rather than the rule, but she's a very public face of both leadership and motherhood. There's little McAllister right at Halloween before Yaboo, the Yahoo event where you bring your children to celebrate Halloween. That's kind of cute. Let's talk about women in leadership and entrepreneurial roles more generally. Carolyn, you have written about women going out on their own to practice law. You're definitely that's your wheelhouse is solo practice of law and everything related to it. And you have been surprised, as am I, that more women don't choose to go that route. Let's talk about that. Why don't we?
I don't know. I mean, it's very disturbing to me, especially at this juncture in our profession. I went to the College of Law Practice and Management Futures Conference 2 weeks ago. And at that conference, they were talking about all these new business models for the practice of law, the Axiom and Paragon sort of high-end contract lawyers and outsourcing, or the firms like, Patrick Lamb's Ballorm, which is sort of a very small, nimble, value-based firm. And with all this opportunity, there was still a speaker who talked about, the need for diversity in firms. And her rationale for it, for being there was very important. I mean, she talked about how it's important for women to have options across the board, and she's right. But I think that whenever we talk about the success of women in the practice of law, and I think one of the articles that you circulated before this talk mentions that, we're always looking at how many women are partners in big firms. And I guess what just bothers me or disturbs me is that why is partnership at a large firm always considered the brass ring? Why is that the metric by which women measure success? I think that as long as being a partner at a big firm is considered the measure of success, women are going to be drawn to that as a goal instead of going out and going solo. And one thing I was thinking about is, maybe we misbranded solo practice. Maybe if it were called startup practice, maybe if I talked about being a startup lawyer more, it would seem cooler, because women who start businesses in Silicon Valley, I mean, maybe there's discrimination or not. I know there are separate issues there, but certainly they're not looked down on. They're not thought of as, somebody who couldn't get a job or someone who's just dabbling in technology. They're thought of as entrepreneurs. And I think that in the legal profession, I think just generally there tends to be, people tend to look down on people who start practices. But I think that because partnership at a big firm is elevated so much, there are still many women who consider that to be a form of accomplishment. And I think that's perhaps why many more don't go and try to start up something on their own.
Could I introduce an issue here? And sure. I am not trying to throw a grenade or be controversial about all this. I'm just trying to have an objective conversation about it. And, naturally these issues are lightning rods. So, I mean, Carolyn, I'd be particularly interested in what you think about this, because, you are the flagship example of entrepreneurialism in the solo practice for everyone, not just women lawyers. Does it have anything to do with any natural inclination? I mean, can we at least agree that there are some inherent differences between the sexes? I mean, there are even some structural differences in the brain, the corpus callosum of a woman's brain, for example.
Sure.
Does it have anything to do with risk tolerance and perhaps women being more risk averse? Because, going out and starting an enterprise is a lot of risk. Most men don't have the the risk tolerance to actually do that. I mean, could that be anything responsible for the skew that we see here, the disparate numbers on this?
That explanation is certainly as good as any other one, because I don't, it's something that I don't completely understand. So, so that is certainly one reason. Other than that, it's hard. It's hard to say. It's hard to say why. But that certainly may be a part of it. I thought about it a lot, but it's just it's difficult for me to kind of get my head around. The only thing is with something like risk tolerance, the one area where that particular feature wouldn't come into play is, many times there are women who leave large law firms, and because they feel like they don't have any other option. And in those situations, some of them are married, and they may want to stay home with their kids or may not. They're sort of undecided. In that situation, there's a little bit less of a risk in starting a firm, because it's sort of like starting the firm versus nothing else. So your theory might explain women not soloing in, like a woman leaving an established law firm to start her own practice, or a woman who's, self-supporting or something like that. But the one area where it wouldn't necessarily explain it is women who leave a big firm because there's not enough work-life balance, but can't find another job and don't consider the solo option for whatever reason. That doesn't make that much sense to me, because there's less of a risk, presuming that their spouse is able to support them or in whole or in part while they're not working.
Well, Joan had to leave us, but we may find some answers to this in an article that she wrote earlier this year. It was following up on a New York Times piece about women forming startups in Silicon Valley. And Joan's piece is called, "Can Mothers Found Startups Hint Yes?" But the New York Times piece quotes angel investor Paige Craig saying out loud, a pretty biased comment, "A pregnant founder / CEO is going to fail her company. I'm thinking, how in the bleep is this founder going to lead a team, build a company, and change the world for these businesses, carrying a kid around for the next few months and then caring for the kids thereafter?" He asked, looking for an answer. And Joan goes through and says, well, this is a real issue of bias here, that, this is why women are maybe more risk averse in these situations, because they've got, hurdles to overcome that make it even harder. And it's not necessarily that all those hurdles are biological, that people are going to look for failure, even if failure is not inevitable. And she calls it the maternal wall bias, an order of magnitude larger than the bias against women in general. Gave people resumes. Let's see, a best known study on this gave people resumes that were identical, except that one but not the other mentioned membership in the PTA. Mothers were 79% less likely to be hired and offered an average of $11,000 less in salary. And noting that gap has nothing to do with performance. The two subjects' resumes were exactly the same. So, just kind of summing up what Joan has written on the topic, that maybe there are hurdles there that make it harder for women to jump into a risky environment. Not to say that they shouldn't do it, but they just may have more to overcome there than their male counterparts would. What do you think, Evan?
That makes good sense. And I was thinking of risk tolerance and risk aversion at a more fundamental level, like the way that our brains are wired. And again, I have to kind of really be careful in prefacing all this, because I don't want to stereotype. That's not my intention at all. It's just to try to look at this objectively and see what some differences that there are between men and women. And the more we can understand them, it seems like that if we understand those issues better, then the more that we can remedy these disparities that we see and have that everybody agrees are bad, like pay, the inequality in, the 70 cents on the dollar issue and all of these perceptions, the discrimination like you're talking about here. And so that's really interesting what you're talking about there, Denise, because it would suggest that it's something, if there is a fundamental biological, biochemical, neurological difference that's contributing to it, there's certainly are other things, other factors that could contribute to a bias that what you cited there about the PTA membership on the resume, very interesting, because that's just that isolates the factor right there, and that has nothing to do with the structure of the brain.
Yeah, Joan sums it up really well. She says the result is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Women give up on their startups or maybe their solo careers as an attorney, Carolyn, or just don't start them in the first place because the system is set up in a way that's unfriendly to women and downright hostile to mothers. The people responsible for the system in turn point to the low numbers of women as a sign that they aren't interested or qualified and therefore refuse to make the changes that would open the industry to the other half of the population. So I guess this is one of those cases where people just have to have particular fortitude to continue down that road. So hats off to you, Carolyn, for having that fortitude and for helping so many others to have it. I mean, you're certainly the guiding light for people who want to go out on their own in the legal world. And that's actually kind of a good transition to another sort of twist on all this that I wanted to bring in. And that is that burnout in certain professions, and definitely the law, which is a real grind, is really, really high. And that's sort of an equal opportunity factor. There was an article on the 24th of October about a guy named Patrick Shields. He was a partner at Quinn Emanuel, a big law firm, who just sort of gave up. Walked away from the profession. Now, that's not an interesting story in its own right. The interesting part is how much this guy's peers were stunned by this. He was one of the leading lights at the law firm, had done everything right. Everything was going his way. Definitely on track for not service partnership, which for people not in the legal profession means you're sort of doing more mundane tasks and working for other people's clients. But, the flagship rainmaker leadership position kind of guy, this guy was on that track. And yet he'd just been through so much. He decided he'd made enough money and was going to get off that terrible, always connected, always on, always working merry-go-round and take some time and figure out what he was going to do with his life after that. He could afford to do it, and so he did it. So Evan, do what do you think about Patrick? Are you seeing that among your peers as well?
No. I wish that our firm was making enough money to see more people doing that.
Right.
I mean, you said it. He finally could afford to do that. So God bless him. Don't we all? At least there's an inkling in all of us that would love to do that. Go and do whatever it is, fill in the blank, tick off items on your bucket list. Don't have to commute, come to the office, deal with the stresses of the adversarial nature of the work that we do. So, I'm sure that it came as a surprise to his his colleagues there because of the commitment that he showed. But it was that very commitment that gave him the means to make this decision to really live an authentic, live from his center and really do something that he was following his bliss, to use the terminology of Joseph Campbell. And so I wish we could all do that.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Carolyn, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I loved that story, and I loved, the genuine sense. I read the Above the Law column article where they're usually very snarky, and the people who felt so genuinely happy for this guy, that was just great. But the thing is like you said, Evan, maybe, there are a lot of our law firms that aren't paying us where we're not earning enough to leave and be financially independent. But think of all the partners who have been at firms for years and years. I mean, surely some of them, if they sell a summer home or something, could afford, partners in their like 60s or 70s who could afford to leave and start another career possibly, or just do something else. And they're hanging on, which is, leading to, there were stories about that just a few years ago with, partners who were, been at firms for years and years who still are trying to hang on to clients that really rightfully maybe should be passed down to more junior partners. So, so I guess it is hard for people to let go. But that was a great story. I think, one of the things about technology and social media is I think it does make it much easier for people to have to go from one career to the next. Like one person I've always admired so much is John Glenn. Astronaut, hotelier, senator. Imagine, I love people who have those, different phases, who go from one career to something completely different. I think that, people are in some ways meant to be like that. I don't think your career has to be like your marriage, monogamous. It just, there's a lot of different, go through a lot of different phases. So, but that was a great story. So I hadn't seen it before.
Polygamous careers. I like that. But do you think, Carolyn, that the whole I've done it, I've done my time, and I'm going to follow my bliss thing, that is there any sort of gender disparity there? If you're a woman, is it as easy to do that?
It's hard to say. One thing that I've seen, and in some ways this is sort of the flip side, we talked about some of the drawbacks of motherhood and the biases that Joan has studied for so long, and that, things like that PTA study, which are just horrific. But the flip side of that is I've seen many women use the period of time when they were staying home with children or working part-time to completely do a shift. I had one friend from law school who had been working at a big firm, and when she had her son, she left to work for a human rights association, and then she got an LLM, and now she's teaching, and she loves it. There are other people like my co-author of Social Media book, Nicole Black, who, had taken time off from her career as a criminal, or I guess she was a civil defense attorney at that time, and just, reinvented herself as a law and technology person. So I think in many ways, sometimes, taking the time out to raise children, part of the time forces you to search for different things that you can do, and it gives you that opportunity to reinvent yourself or to seek out, other options or find the things that matter to you, which becomes very much important. When you're spending part of your time with kids and your time is limited, you have to make sure that the stuff you're doing outside of watching your kids really counts. That's stuff that you really love, because it's taking time away from them. So I think in some ways, some women in some situations potentially do have that opportunity. And again, it's just, it's not a generalization, but I think it's not necessarily harder for women to answer your question. I think it just depends on the situation, just as it did for this guy, leaving a job and having the money to do it.
All right. Well, we've talked about Marissa Mayer breaking through Silicon Valley glass ceilings and pay gaps. Silicon Valley certainly is not immune from the kind of bias that we see, sort of in a longstanding way in the legal profession. But I think it's been a quieter kind of development there, maybe because just women, we were talking about how fewer women form startups. Maybe it's just that the women haven't traditionally had the visible leadership roles there. Somebody who was a pretty high level partner in Kleiner Perkins finally did what I didn't do and decided that, if she was experiencing a harassment kind of environment at her work, she was going to sue. Her name is Ellen Pao. So that has been going on now for several months, and there's no resolution to it yet, but just bring it up because it is kind of a high-profile sexual harassment suit that involves a big Silicon Valley firm, Kleiner Perkins. And then probably more entertaining and more ongoing, probably more fun to follow, is there's a new show on Bravo, of all things, called Silicon Valley Startups. So, we've got... let me get through to the article on that, and I can tell you some more about it. I haven't seen it yet. Evan, have you seen Startups? It looks like a fun show to tune into.
No, I stopped watching Bravo when Queer Eye for the Straight Guy went off, so I've missed it. That's why I look so disheveled now. I don't have any guidance anymore.
Right. So it's got... doesn't it have one of the Facebook, like Mark Zuckerberg's sister? I think she's one of the people on the reality show. Have you seen it, Carolyn?
No, I haven't, but I read that article. I read everything you passed around this week, and it looks, it is on Bravo, though. It's reality TV, so I'm not sure what people completely expect. There's always going to be edits. No one's going to look back.
Randy Zuckerberg is her name. And so... is this like a great moment for women in technology and law and other professions that there's, a Bravo show following women entrepreneurs? Maybe, but this article in Forbes is a little skeptical that it's just going to devolve into, typical reality TV show fare and capitalize on the drama as opposed to the actual, forward advances that may be happening here. So I don't know. It's one to put on the DVR, and we'll see what sort of impact it has. All right, let's get to our resource and tip of the week, both of which are from Harvard on the East Coast. The first, this is our resource of the week, and I really encourage people to go check it out. It's called Project Implicit. It is a project that is gathering data on people's attitudes toward bias. And then I take it they are putting together findings, and will do reports and studies and be able to make some statements about everything they've gathered. But what you do is you go and you take a test. And the tests are on subjects like gender and career, whether you have different attitudes toward people who are Asian American, different attitudes about religion, gender and science, Native American, let's see, presidents. I haven't taken the president's test, but I'm interested in seeing what that one's all about. Weight, sexuality, Arabs and Muslims, skin tone, race, disability, weapons. Okay.
iPhone versus iOS
weapons
versus
associated with race and also age. So what you do, I took a couple of these tests, and they're really eye-opening to go do. I took the one on gender and science and the one on gender and career. And the findings for me on gender and science is that I was more likely to associate women with sort of scientific careers than most people are. But then on the gender one, and this surprised the heck out of me, I was more likely to associate women with non-career kind of things, with staying home and raising the kids. And that's certainly not been, the track that I've taken until pretty recently in my life. So it's eye-opening both for you and to see what the other people who've responded to the test have said, because they sort of show where you are in the whole skew of results that they have. So it's called Project Implicit. Go check it out. Did either of you go take the tests before the show?
I haven't, but I'm going to. It sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is. It only takes about 10 or 15 minutes to take one of the tests, and you're it kind of messes with you. It tries to see what you're most readily going to associate terms with. So it's like a computer, it's like a video game almost. You have to kind of use your keyboard in a way that quickly scrolls through topics and makes associations. And you might be surprised what you find. Mm-hmm. And then the other article, this time from, let me see, I already had this one pulled up, from Harvard Business Review. This is one that Joan was interviewed for, and it is on how to negotiate your parental leave. So if you are interested in taking parental leave, you have an employer that offers that kind of thing, whether you're a male or a female. Joan and the others who contributed to this have some great tips, including doing background research to understand what types of leaves others in your organization have taken and what other companies offer that are competitive to your own. Start by talking to your manager about the leave you hope to take. Ask for the longest amount of time you can afford. You can always return to work earlier if you choose to. So that's taking the anti-Marissa Meyer route. And then they also have some don'ts. Don't shy away from taking the full leave offered to you, especially if you're a father. Frame your negotiation as an exception to the existing policy. Try to set it up as an experiment instead, and negotiate if you aren't in good standing as an employee. I'm not quite sure what that last one means. It seems like you're able to negotiate better if you are in good standing, but I'm sure there's more detail on that in the article over at Harvard Business Review. We've got links to that article and everything else we've discussed on the show today in our talking points collected at Delicious. That's at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw/187. And this has been a really fun show, a neat departure for us, I think. And it's been great chatting with you guys. Carolyn, any final thoughts before we close things out?
No, thank you for having me. I've always kind of wondered what went on behind the scenes. I'm an occasional viewer, so this is very neat, very smooth operation, very cool. So thank you.
Thanks. It's been very cool having you. Evan, thank you. I'm sorry for the person that you're going to have to beat up after this. Make sure that they know that we did not suggest that you go do that.
No, I think I'm all good. You know, it's really been enlightening. I mean, I have to admit that I had some trepidation coming into all this. Not that I was, not wanting to have this conversation, but, I'm really glad that we could share these ideas and these issues and talk about them in a way. There's no doubt these are critical. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. Carolyn, I feel like I've known you for years. I followed your work. I followed you on Twitter, read your blog and your other works, and so it's great to finally meet you in this context. So I've really enjoyed talking with you. So glad we can connect.
Yeah, definitely. I'm surprised our paths have not crossed in person, but I'm sure they will.
Yes.
Yeah, me too, Carolyn. I mean, certainly we've all been rattling around the interwebs for a long, long time, and it's great to finally get the chance to chat with you.
Yeah. So this is good. Thank you.
Thank you. I remember seeing, and I didn't bookmark it, but I remember seeing a video of you on YouTube that was a great rant about technology that sort of seemed to fit with some of the themes we've talked about today about technology overtaking our lives. Was I imagining that? Did you speak on that subject somewhere?
I talked a little bit at the Ignite talk more about the sort of these intrusions on privacy and the implications for confidentiality that we don't necessarily think about. And I think these are issues that are just going to be becoming more acute now that we have so many technologies that can track big data and analyze it. I mean, so it's more about things like thinking twice about tweeting from tweeting that you're going to Mountain View for big meeting or something like that, and kind of giving away confidential buyout that your client might be having. So maybe that's what it was, but
that is what I was thinking of. Well, we're going to have to get you back on the show to talk more about privacy and confidentiality and how technology allows for leaks in ways that we never needed to worry about in the past.
Exactly.
But for now, this has been a really fun discussion about bias in the workplace and where we've come, whether we've come a long way, and how it might impact the laws that are made in the country, as it certainly has impacted the people getting elected to make those laws. So I really appreciate you all tuning in and joining us for this discussion today. So we'll make our second MCLA passphrase for this episode of This Week in Law, Marissa. You can find this and all our shows at twit.tv/TWiL. Our whole archive of shows is there. As we're getting ready for the shows, we'd love to hear from you. We love to hear what's on your mind, any reactions you've had to this show or any of our others. You can email Evan and I. He is Evan at twit.tv. I'm Denise at twit.tv. We have a Facebook page and a Google Plus page where you can weigh in on those things. You can hit us up on Twitter. He's Internet Cases. I am D. Howell over there. Carolyn is Carolyn Elefant on Twitter and always is tweeting great stuff too. So definitely go follow her if you have not done so already. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of This Week in Law next week. Take care. Until then.